Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Thursday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have good, bad, and crazy martinis for conservatives today. Very nice to be back on the regular schedule after yesterday's dumpster fire of news for conservatives. We're also brought to you today by ZipRecruiter. Right now, Three Martini Lunch listeners can try ZipRecruiter for free at this exclusive web address, ziprecruiter.com/martini. Much more on ZipRecruiter a little bit later in the podcast. Jim, let's start with our good martini. We are now less than 11 weeks until the midterm elections. Still looking like a tougher road than we'd like to keep the House. The map is definitely in our favor for the Senate, but nothing's being taken for granted. But we always like to highlight good news, and in the latest batch of polls, we've got at least two pieces. There's been a number of Senate polls just in the last couple of days, and there's reason to be optimistic in a number of races here for Republicans and for conservatives. First of all, in Florida, in a new poll out of Florida Atlantic University, Governor Rick Scott's at 45%, and Democratic three-term incumbent Bill Nelson is only at 39%. So Scott plus 6 and the incumbent's under 40. I'm really liking that. Up in Wisconsin, this is one of those states where, right after the 2016 election, they said, hey, look at all these states where Democratic senators are up for election and states that Trump won. And then a couple of them started to slip away. It doesn't look like we have much of a chance in Michigan. And a lot of people said Wisconsin was in that same boat. But they just had the primary there. State Senator Leah Vukmir is the Republican nominee. And a new Marquette poll shows that Tammy Baldwin is only up 49-47 on Vukmir. Just a 2-point margin, which I would assume was within the margin of error. And so, Jim, we've been kind of keeping our eye on Florida for a while. And the 6-point margin is nice to see. The fact that we might have a real shot at Wisconsin is a great way to start the day.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that if Leah Vukmir wins the Senate race in Wisconsin, Republicans keep control of the Senate, period. Because that's really one of those races that nobody had. If nobody, it's not to say that no one had it on their list. I think it's safe to say no one really had it in their top tier. Everybody kind of knew Baldwin was not in the best of shape for a Democratic incumbent, but that there were other ones who were in worse shape, including Bill Nelson, which I'll talk about in a second. Look, if this one's close, it's a bonus for Republicans. And look, this is a state where Republicans have had a fairly sizable resurgence year by year between Scott Walker's victories in the gubernatorial races, Ron Johnson winning the last two times he's been before the Senate. Obviously, it's Paul Ryan's home state, and of course, Trump carried it. So people have asked, is it safe to say Wisconsin is not really a blue state anymore, kind of more of a purple state? And some were saying, is it fair to argue it's a red state? I think if Vukmir wins, I think you can make that argument. A pretty significant political shift out of it. And obviously, look, this is one poll. Don't put your carts before the horse. Don't count your chickens before they hatch, et cetera, et cetera. But you throw in the Nelson news. And, I had a Florida Republican consultant kind of summarize Bill Nelson's campaigns for the last two cycles. Hi there. Remember me? I'm Bill Nelson. I've been your senator for the past 6 years, and you haven't noticed. But I used to be an astronaut. And astronauts are cool, aren't they? Vote Bill Nelson this November. Bill Nelson is a Democrat and has you consider the role of Florida in our politics, the 2000 election, and it's always been this big key swing state. Marco Rubio, obviously rising to prominence in his first term. You look at Rick Scott, for a while was generating some discussion about whether he has future plans for thinking of running nationally. I think it's down the road. But Bill Nelson has just kind of been there. He's getting up in years. I don't think I'm being too ageist to point out he's had a couple of cases where he's run into controversies, including one where he wrote a letter to the EPA about a particular rule, and he said he had no memory of writing that letter. Little things like that are kind of suggesting that Nelson is not at the top of his game. Rick Scott has slightly more money than God. And look, you add all that up, and Florida has been a Republican trending state. I would just throw one or two more polls on the list here. Reuters' most recent poll has Democrats only up by 4 in the generic congressional vote. That's a little bit more narrow than we've seen and not what Democrats would like to see if they've got high hopes of retaking the House. Bob Menendez. Now, look, I grew up in New Jersey. I have no real hopes that Republicans will win in New Jersey anytime soon and or that there will ever be a consequence for corruption amongst Democrats. in the state of New Jersey. Having said that, Bob Menendez is only up by 43% to 37%, a little bit more narrow than you'd expect. Usually there is zero consequence for corruption. I grew up covering, or my early career was spent covering Bob Torricelli. Maybe this one, the things break a certain way in that one. A lot of Democrats dancing a jig over the NBC News poll that has Ted Cruz only ahead by 4 over Beto O'Rourke, 49 to 45. Look, is that closer than Ted Cruz would like? Yeah, I think, but all things considered, you generally should be betting on a Republican in a statewide race in Texas. It's been, more than a decade since Democrats even come close in a statewide race. Yeah, Beto O'Rourke is better than your average Texas Democratic candidate. Good for him for that. It's fascinating to watch Democrats just unbelievably excited and just throwing tons of money at a race where the Democrat has never led. It's also worth noting the same poll found Greg Abbott, the incumbent governor, ahead by 19. I don't know if I see a 20-point split between the governor's race and the Senate race in Texas. Stranger things have happened, but I just don't see that shaking out that way.
Yeah, I would agree. And you mentioned the New Jersey race with Menendez only up 43-37. Not a great number for an incumbent, but it is a deeply blue state most of the time. But you mentioned covering Bob Torricelli. So if Menendez tanks in the poll, Frank Lautenberg can't bail him out this time. So what happens then?
The Torricelli maneuver, which everybody says, man, that was the worst Star Trek episode of all time. The idea that, if your candidate's in really lousy shape, well, you just switch him out at the last second after the legal deadline, because the state Supreme Court's going to say, yeah, whatever you need to do, go ahead. Just go ahead. You need to switch him. It's okay. Find somebody. But yeah, they've run out of old, decrepit, reliable, Bartles and James resembling old man senators so they can roll out of the retirement home, hope that he doesn't drool on the microphone and, cruise to victory in November.
So if you're looking for a new senator, and if you have a current Democrat, hopefully you are looking for a new senator come November, check them out and support a Republican, especially if it's a good Republican. But finding a person to hire can be challenging. But there's one place you can go where hiring is simple. It's fast and it's smart. A place where growing businesses connect to qualified candidates. And that place is ZipRecruiter.com/Martini.
ZipRecruiter sends your job to more than 100 of the web's leading job boards. But they don't stop there. With their powerful matching technology, ZipRecruiter scans thousands of resumes to find people with the right experience and invites them to apply to your job. As applications come in, ZipRecruiter analyzes each one and spotlights the top candidates so that you never miss a great match. ZipRecruiter is so effective that 80% of employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate through the site within the first day.
With results like that, it is no wonder that ZipRecruiter is the highest rated hiring site in America. And right now, 3 Martini Lunch listeners can try ZipRecruiter for free at this exclusive web address, ZipRecruiter.com/Martini. That's ZipRecruiter.com/MARTINI. ZipRecruiter.com/Martini. Because after all, ZipRecruiter is the smartest way to hire. All right, Jim, let's move to our bad martini now, and it's taking off a little bit from yesterday's third bad martini, which was the media's handling of the news that an illegal immigrant is in custody for the murder of Mollie Tibbetts, the University of Iowa student who was found dead, apparently, in the last day or two here. She had been missing for a number of weeks. A lot of attention on the story. To the credit of John Bertman over at CNN, he brought up the issue when he was interviewing Elizabeth Warren about a number of things yesterday on CNN. And Elizabeth Warren's almost callous response here is quite eye-opening. Here's what she had to say when Berman brought up the issue.
Mike Pence and the president have suggested the immigration laws need to be stronger so that people like this man who was accused of this murder were not in the country. Your reaction?
I'm so sorry for the family here, and I know this is hard, not only for the family, but for the people in her community, the people throughout Iowa. But one of the things we have to remember is we need an immigration system that is effective, that focuses on where real problems are. Last month, I went down to the border, and I saw where children had been taken away from their mothers. I met with those mothers who had been lied to, who didn't know where their children were, who hadn't had a chance to talk to their children. And there was no plan for how they would be reunified with their children. I think we need immigration laws that focus on people who pose a real threat. And I don't think mamas and babies are the place that we should be spending our resources.
I'm getting confused here, Jim, because it almost sounded like at the end that we need to be focusing on real problems, which I would assume is people who are a threat to murder people when they come into the country illegally. And obviously the debate played out in June. It's still playing out about the separation at the border, and there's plenty of different ways to suggest perhaps improving the system. But there's a lot of families who are permanently separated from their kids, the Tibbetts family being the latest one, as a result of criminal activity from illegal aliens. And then you throw on the people who have been assaulted physically or sexually, people injured by drunk drivers, people robbed, and so forth. The idea that this is not an issue, not a problem, just shows how tone deaf she is.
It's not just Warren. It's worth mentioning, Greg, that when you see a story like this come forward, whether it's this case, the young woman in San Francisco, the linebacker for the Indianapolis Colts who was killed by an illegal immigrant drunk driver, there's always the tone of Republicans pounce on these crimes, these deadly events. Why would this not upset Democrats? Why would this not upset people who are politically unaffiliated? Why do you have to be a Republican to hear a story like this and get really bothered by it and say, look, entirely separate of whether you believe in a path for citizenship, et cetera, this man and these three examples and many more examples across the country, they weren't supposed to be in the country. And they were not here to live the American dream. There was not so inspiring story next. No, these were criminals. They were criminals, they committed crimes, and people are dead because of that. And Elizabeth Warren, I mean, she begins in the very beginning, and it is the most cursory check the box. I'm really sorry about this, but now I'd really like to pivot to my talking points about family separation. And it's maddening. I talked a little bit about this yesterday, but it just seems like a further example of how we should be able to have a much better debate on this. And I'm very intrigued by the mentality on the left that seems to be, if you acknowledge that some illegal immigrants commit violent crimes, that somehow there's going to be this massive pogrom-like authoritarian clampdown going door to door, rounding up illegal immigrants out of their houses and shipping them away on boxcars, as Hillary Clinton had memorably described one time. I don't think those are the only two options. I really think we could do a better job of, A, securing the border so that people cannot cross over illegally as easily as they do now. And we've already seen certain progress in certain sectors on this, but obviously I think it's safe to say we do not have it quite, to the level we want of border security, where it is exceptionally difficult to sneak into the country. And secondly, we need a system so that if you overstay a legal visa, you're allowed to stay in the country temporarily, and your expiration date comes and you decide just to go underground, you stay in the country, you don't leave, which is apparently around 5 million of the illegal immigrants in this country entered in this form. We need a way to track them down and send them back and say, no, if you have a temporary visa, it's temporary. It's not a stay if you want to type situation. These shouldn't be controversial, crazy concepts here. And I really, I wrote about this extensively in the Morning Jolt. I was thinking about that Indianapolis Colts player, and I was thinking about the DUI. And if you are a sanctuary, certain sanctuary cities, including New York City, do not consider a DUI sufficient reason to turn someone over to ICE. They consider it a minor crime. Well, obviously, the matter of a driver under the influence of alcohol, whether or not they kill someone, is almost entirely a matter of luck, right? It's not a matter of, they only drank a little bit. A DUI does carry a fairly significant criminal sentence under New York state law. However, the city of New York has decided it's not enough reason that this person should be deported. Now, what that adds up to, in my mind, Greg, maybe other people will see it differently, is we consider drunk driving a really serious offense unless you're an illegal immigrant, and then we will not cooperate with ICE. And that strikes me as a situation where we're going to judge citizens by a harsher standard than we do illegal immigrants. And if you think there is a rising tide of xenophobia in this country, if you feel like we've gone from being anti-illegal immigrant to anti-immigrant, if you're troubled by this, as I am, then I think you have to ask yourself, how did this mentality take root? What is fueling it? And I think it's the decisions of sanctuary cities like this. Bill de Blasio said, I think that a DUI, as long as you don't actually hurt anyone, is a minor crime. And, why the notorious groundhog murderer, Bill de Blasio, does not get pelted with rotten fruit everywhere he goes is beyond me. And I think it indicates just the open, how preeminent the value of never deporting everyone is in the minds of some Democrats, Greg.
Absolutely. And there's two other things that come to mind here. One, we talked about yesterday how a lot of folks in the media were saying, hey, this guy was hired by a farm owned by a Republican. What we found out is there was another crime committed, which doesn't get talked about a lot. This guy stole somebody else's identity, had a different social security card and a different ID with a totally different name on it. And so when the people who own this farm found out what this guy's real identity was, they were completely surprised. I don't know if the person he stole it from is dead or are just getting fleeced out of money and all sorts of other things, but that's another big problem. My other thing is Elizabeth Warren with casually dismissing, really sorry for you people in Iowa. Does she know where the 2020 nominating process begins?
Look, if Hillary didn't know where Wisconsin was, geography may not be their strong side.
Jim, let's move to our crazy martini now, and jumping off of yesterday's first bad martini. And that, of course, is the president's former attorney, Michael Cohen, pleading guilty to 8 counts, implicating the president in a campaign finance violation. Not to be surprised by this, but the Democrats, who are already looking for any possible way to delay consideration of the Brett Kavanaugh nomination, whether it's his papers from the Bush years or his time with Ken Starr, what have you. Now Chuck Schumer has decided that because of what Michael Cohen has said in court, that the Senate can't possibly move forward on this now.
A president identified as an unindicted co-conspirator of a federal crime, an accusation made not by a political enemy but by the closest of his own confidants, is on the verge of making a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court, a court that may someday soon determine the extent of the president's legal jeopardy. In my view, the Senate Judiciary Committee should immediately pause the consideration of the Kavanaugh nomination.
Oh, Jim, it's Thursday. Is that a good enough reason to pause it, too? I mean, this is about the third or fourth reason they've come up with that we can't possibly move forward on this.
Yeah, I heard this same kind of statement from Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts last night, Greg, who said that he will not take a meeting with Brett Kavanaugh. He has been nominated by someone implicated and all but named as a co-conspirator in federal crimes. Good to know that Ed Markey believes that if you're accused, you're guilty. Your nomination is tainted, and he should be considered illegitimate. So a lot of questions come out of this mentality, Greg. The first is why he thinks we should care because he announced his opposition to Kavanaugh the night he was nominated.
Right.
How did that meeting going to go? I hate you. What do you feel about X, Y, and Z? I don't get, what Markey seems to think it's a very big deal that he's refusing to meet with somebody he's already announced he will oppose in any circumstances. But there's a whole bunch of things that float out of this. Greg, if being nominated by someone who is implicated in crimes makes you illegitimate, when does Ed Markey move to impeach and remove from the bench Stephen Breyer and Ruth Bader Ginsburg? Because if we're going to do that, fine, that's fine. The next question that comes out of this is, look, we have 8 justices. We're trying to get this nominee confirmed in time for the start of the term. Don't think it's going to reach that. I believe it's the first Monday in October. Might be a little bit after that, but a lot of people think that probably by end of October, early November, right before Election Day, is when you probably would see the Senate confirm Kavanaugh. The question would be, though, that if you believe that Kavanaugh is tainted and illegitimate because Trump nominated him, well, any other justice would be the same category. So the real argument is Ed Markey believes that no one nominated by President Trump should be confirmed to the Supreme Court. And this kind of is in keeping with a general attitude amongst, I think, a significant chunk of the Democratic Party that Donald Trump is not a legitimate president, that no matter what the Constitution says, no matter what the electoral outcome was, that because he hasn't met some threshold, because he didn't win the popular vote, because he's really controversial, because they really can't stand him, because of a whole, and of course now because of Michael Cohen's thing, that he's not really the legitimate president of the United States, and therefore he should not exercise any of the powers that the president of the United States is allowed to exercise under the Constitution. Now, that leaves you with a fairly significant problem because we have 8 justices, and yes, we got through the better part of a year after Scalia passed away, but Donald Trump, barring a impeachment in 2019, isn't going anywhere anytime soon. So the argument of Ed Markey, whether he acknowledges it or not, is that the Supreme Court should have 8 justices, or maybe even less, depending on the health of some of them, for the next 2.5 years. And what happens if Trump wins a second term? I guess there should be only 8 justices for another 6 years. And at that point, who knows, 1 or 2 might fall. Heaven forbid, this is the example, it's being a little bit ridiculous, but I think it's an extension of where the Ed Markey logic takes you. God forbid, there's a terrible disaster at the Supreme Court building, structural failure, the roof collapses, and all of the justices die. It'd be a terrible day in American history. We'd have 0 Supreme Court justices. And under Ed Markey's philosophy, there would be no Supreme Court replacements until there's a new president. We just operate without a Supreme Court for however long it takes. That's what happens when you argue that a president doesn't really have the powers that he does. You don't have to like it, Ed Markey, but you have to live with it. This is the president we have. This is the president we elected. You want to vote against him, fine. But really, this is also, by the way, what confirmation hearings are for. If you really want to ask Kavanaugh, are you tainted because of Trump? You can have that exchange with him during the confirmation hearing. But that's the sort of thing that kind of require you to not announce your opposition literally minutes after he's named by the president as his nominee.
In some of those movies where you feed computers or robots conflicting information and their heads explode, what do you think would have happened if Trump, just as a lark, would have nominated Merrick Garland? Because we can't support him because Trump nominated him, but he, of course, is the patron saint of Republican obstructionism. So it'd be fascinating.
I see the Democrats feeling, we nominated Merrick Garland. You guys didn't even give him a hearing. The more this recedes into the rearview mirror, I think you can make an argument that Merrick Garland deserved a hearing, right? He was a presidential nominee. You want to, have him meet with the senators, fine. You want to have the hearing, fine. But there's really nothing that says Republican senators had to vote for a nominee that they don't like. There's nothing that says Republican. You know what? No, he's a left of center nominee. Yes, he's centrist by the standards of the Obama administration, but I just don't like the kind of decisions he's going to make. And if you think that's an unfair standard, that is exactly the standard that Democrats applied to Roberts and Alito. We have not had these 98-0 votes like we used to have for Scalia and Ginsburg and things like that. That was a long time ago. So we could have gone through the process, and Senate Republicans could have rejected Merrick Garland and sent it back to 0 and done that as many times as they needed to run out the clock until the 2016 election. Maybe that would have been fairer. I don't know. But I don't think it would have changed where we are, which is to have Justice Neil Gorsuch and an empty seat and the question of, okay, so what do we want to do about this empty seat? Because right now the opposition party's viewpoint is we don't like this nominee. We don't like any nominee from this president. We will not vote for any of these. It is probably a safe bet that for the foreseeable future, if the Senate is of a different party than the sitting president, you will not see a justice confirmed, period, regardless of quality, regardless of consensus, unless it's like really close and it's 51-49 and one senator feels the pressure and flips and the vice president breaks the tie or something like that. I think we're now at a point where you just won't see senators voting for a Supreme Court justice nominated of a president of the opposition party. So if you want to have divided government, America, choose carefully. You may end up short a few Supreme Court justices at that rate.
Thanks a lot, Ted Kennedy. You got the ball rolling on all this stuff. Yeah. 30 years ago. Anyway, I still think Kavanaugh's going to be on the bench, but we'll follow here. The hearings start in a couple of weeks. Jim, good to be with you as always. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. And right now, 3 Martini Lunch listeners can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/martini. Tune in again Thursday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.